And
we are back. For those of you who were tuned in, we had a very spirited conversation led by Imran Dasu. Thank you so much. And now we are moving on. We are going to be talking about funding women's business models. And I am absolutely delighted to introduce, as the moderator, my colleague and a senior reporter at Quartz Media, Lila MacLellan. Lila, over to you.
Thank you so much, Francesca. So thank you so much for having me here today. I'm really excited to get started and introduce our panelists. Marie George is the president of WILLA, the first European incubator for women-led startups. With a network of 250 experts, WILLA provides 400 startup founders with training and coaching on entrepreneurial skills annually. And it partners with incubators, investors, and companies to grow the pipeline of women entrepreneurs and bring more diversity to the tech and innovation ecosystem. Amanda Hindlian is Global Head of Capital Markets at New York Stock Exchange. In this role, she oversees the teams responsible for attracting new listings to the exchange, and she works with entrepreneurs, venture capitalists, private equity firms, and investment banks to advise private companies as they move toward an NYC public listing. Prior to joining the New York Stock Exchange, she was a former partner and chief operating officer of global investment research at Goldman Sachs. So, Amanda, how long were you at Goldman Sachs before moving on to the New York Stock Exchange?
Well, thank you so much for having me today. It's really a pleasure to be here, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. I was at Goldman for almost 2 full decades. So I started as an equity research analyst, did a lot of different things over the course of my career there, was fortunate to make partner, and have been at the New York Stock Exchange now for just about a year during a really exciting time.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much for being here. And Marie, hello. Are you in? I think Amanda's in New York today. You're in Paris?
Yes, I am. Hi, Lila. I'm very happy to be here today. Yes, I'm in Paris, and I will be at the global meeting tomorrow in Paris for the live session tomorrow. Yes, I'm the president of WILLA for 6 years, but I've been an entrepreneur, and when I started my first company, I've been myself accompanied by WILLA 15 years ago.
Okay, thank you. I'm eager to hear more about it. So I'll introduce this topic of our discussion today. The pandemic has been a setback for women entrepreneurs, with nearly 4 in 10 in some countries reporting that they will need to shut their doors as a result. Women have been disproportionately impacted in other ways, from the extreme burden of unpaid care work, which is something we cover quite a lot at Quartz, to the increase of domestic and sexual violence, to the disappearance of women-owned businesses. So the question we have today facing us is, how can we fast-track women entrepreneurs to compensate for this enormous setback? And I know that we really want to focus on solutions today. So I wanted to quickly run through some of what we know as the challenges facing women who are running their own businesses and starting their own businesses, even before the pandemic. We know that in absolute terms, there's been progress over the last 10 years, but in terms of the proportion, say, of venture capital and private equity money that's going to companies founded by women, it's still quite low. It seems to have stalled out in terms of VC money in the seed stage at like 2 or 3% in the US. And it gets slightly better if the founders are mixed genders, right? That moves it all the way up to 6 or 9%. We know that networks have been, networks around startups and investors have been male dominated, and that creates a kind of circle that's hard to break. We know that women are expected to deal with more caregiving and parenting responsibilities. And we also know that just culturally, I mean, bias is behind all of this, but culturally we also have this idea of what a successful entrepreneur looks like. And so women have to be that much, studies have even shown that women need to be that much better. Their ideas have to be really novel for, say, a hypothetical investor to take that person seriously. So I'm wondering if you've seen all of these things, and then what has also happened during the pandemic. And of all of these ideas, what issue would you say is the priority where, if we could fix that, there would be a trickle-down effect? Maybe I'll start with you, Marie.
Yes, I think actually that all of the issues that you have mentioned are the different effects of the same cause, which is the fact that we've been living in a biased and unequitable world forever, where women and minorities have to struggle if they want to have the same rights and access similar positions as the dominant part of the population. So I think all of these issues have to be tackled at the same time. And the more we address all of them, the more it will be effective, because we are looking to have a really systemic effect, like more a chain reaction than a trickle-down effect, I think. So I think we need to break this vicious circle by conducting very proactive actions, and I can list a few of them. First, we need to create spaces and places that really favor the hatching of women-led startups and companies. This is what I do in my organization. This incubator that has been created 16 years ago in France, called WILLA, has been incubating women-led startups, 400 each year. And so what we do is that we only incubate projects with at least one woman amongst the founding team. It can be one woman alone, it can be one woman and three men, but there has to be one woman at least. And we provide some training, some coaching on entrepreneurial skills to really accelerate their journey. And we do that at a very early stage, because it's really about making sure that we create the pipeline of women entrepreneurs, because it's a very long journey. So we need to make sure that we have enough women at the beginning of the journey to make sure that once they get to Amanda, when they want to go public, then we have women-led companies. So we need to make sure that we have as many women as possible on the starting line, and this is what we contribute to do at WILLA. Also, we need to coach them on the appropriate fundraising strategy. A lot of women entrepreneurs turn to us because they need help on this topic. How much money should they raise? How should they turn to? Who should they turn to? Sorry. How should they fight those biases they face when they have bankers or male VCs in front of them? So that's something we do. And also we need to also partner with the ecosystem. We need to have more female startuppers, but we also need to have bankers, VCs, CVCs being completely aware of the situation and committing to having the same type of proactive actions and committing to set quotas, for example. So 2 years ago, we have done this charter that we shared that has been signed by funds, VCs, private equity funds, saying that they commit to build this pipeline, to commit to fund 30% of women by 2030. So it has to be a common effort and a joint commitment to really make space for women and allow women to join this entrepreneurial and tech world.
Oh, great. Thank you. So that charter was actually put together before the pandemic began. Is that right?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. Well, interesting. Thank you. And Amanda, I guess I'll ask you the same question. What would you prioritize, and what do you see in those later stages?
So it's a great question, and I agree with much of what Marie said. I do think, if you look at what has happened in the aggregate, This is a complex problem. If it were a simple problem, I think it would have been solved within the last 5 years because so much effort and attention has started to shift towards it. That's not to say it's enough effort, not to say it's enough attention, but there certainly was a period of time, even prior to the pandemic, where it felt like more corporate resources were going into investing in women, more venture capital assets were at least being looked at and considered for women. And, sometimes the complexity of a problem enables sort of society to take a step back during a crisis and say, actually, let's put the crisis first, meaning the pandemic, and let's worry about the secondary crisis of what's going on with women entrepreneurs and, frankly, gender parity in general once we get through the pandemic. And I think that was a really fatal mistake that you could predict would happen and did actually happen during the pandemic. And so when I think about all of the different issues that you've raised, I think many of them are true. And I think the reality is that means there's inherent complexity underpinning the situation, which means you can't take your eye off the ball. You can't take your eye off the ball or refocus on any other issue in a disproportionate way and expect that the topic of gender parity, and particularly as it relates to female entrepreneurs and generally women's economic empowerment, is going to be resolved. It won't. And so from my opinion and from my perspective, I think it takes an incredibly concerted effort, and Marie touched on this, but the idea is everybody has to partake. This is not a women's problem. This is a problem for society in general. This is a problem that men need to lean into. And in fact, if they don't, will be disproportionately negatively affected since men are overrepresented in senior leadership positions today. That's factually true. And therefore, in order for the needle to move faster, we need them to lean into this problem and not to ever find an excuse to lean out. So again, I think a lot of what Marie said is true. And what I would add to that is just, it's a complex problem. We saw the pandemic be used as an excuse to look away from the problem for too long, in my opinion.
Okay, great, right. And I'm just curious what you've actually seen from women who are starting businesses or running businesses and looking for investments during the pandemic. Like what happened? Was it less busy at WILLA, for example, Marie?
I mean, the situation was bad, and it has made the situation worse because for women entrepreneurs, because what happened during the pandemic is that it has really widened the gap in, for example, the wage gap between men and women, and for women entrepreneurs, for example, in France, there has been this study that showed that the revenues in the global population had lowered by 30% during the pandemic because of the slowing down of the economy in general. That's 30% is for the general population, but for entrepreneurs, for male entrepreneurs, it was a reduction by 50%, and for women entrepreneurs, a reduction by 60%. So it has been worse for entrepreneurs in general, but again, worse for women entrepreneurs. A lot of them have been obliged to simply stop the businesses that they were working on. For example, we had a lot of women entrepreneurs who had just started working on their companies that have been obliged to stop everything, take care of the family, etc. So it has been a very, very difficult situation. But also, and this is looking at that was looking at the dark side. If I look at the bright side, is that it has been an opportunity for us. For example, what we have done is that we have done the programs that we were used to do, for example, in face-to-face. We have done them remotely. like with Teams or digital tools, and women told us that it was great that they had those appointments and regular meetings in order to keep on working on their businesses and feeling less isolated and being able to connect amongst with other entrepreneurs. And we have digitalized a lot of our programs, and now we are able to reach far more women that we were able to before the pandemics. In France in general, in the regions, places that are really far from Paris, and we can touch and reach women everywhere in the country. So that's the bright side. And another bright side is really the fact that this pandemic has really shed the light on the challenges and the urge really to transition our world into a more sustainable one, to fight climate change, to find solutions to prevent the rise of inequalities, etc. And in this field, we have seen really the rise of new business models, of very innovative, sustainable business models that have been launched by women. And that has really strengthened the place and the absolute necessity for women to join the game to change the world. And we have seen this really massively.
Oh, great.
There's one other, I very much agree with what Marie said, but there's one other facet to sort of consider as you think about what happened during the pandemic, which is that women have over time disproportionately been expected to bear the brunt of the work at home. And this isn't just an issue for female entrepreneurs, it's an issue more broadly, and a bit of a sort of chicken and the egg, which one came first. But what ends up happening is this cycle where when women are paid less than men serially in the corporate workforce, forget about entrepreneurship for one moment, when there's a break point in a family setting, such as the one that the pandemic caused, because so many children had to stay home from school, and therefore an adult was in some ways required to oversee them, or it was very stressful and challenging at home. I can speak to that from personal experience. And because the woman tends to make less than the man on average across many countries, the obvious answer has always been, well, then you, the woman, step back from the workforce first and be the one to put your career on the back burner because you're needed at home and you happen to also make less money, which means the family should persist on the higher income if you have to choose between the two. And I think for female entrepreneurs, there was a little bit of that burden as well, which said to them, this isn't the time when you can take the risk of going out and starting a company. Certainly you couldn't leverage or wouldn't want to leverage your own personal savings at a time like that, particularly if your family was under duress. And so it's a little bit of a different dynamic, but I think it played itself out over both the workforce and the entrepreneurial ecosystem more broadly. And what it really comes down to is, there can't be the expectation that the work at home is predominantly done by women. And if you look at the data, even the OECD data as an example, women tend to do work at home that is daily, that requires their sort of daily commitment in the home, whereas men tend to do work at home at a much less rate, but also they do work that can be more sporadic. And so therefore doesn't necessarily require them to sort of lean out of work for a period of time in order to be useful at home. And that goes back to the original point of some of these foundational issues. They're complicated and they require more than one solution because we're talking about some pretty significant biased sociological, anthropological elements here about how it is that we operate as people, as couples, as families, as unions, and what the expectations are in general. And of course, when you generalize, you're generalizing. It's not true in every situation, but it plays itself out in the data. And I think it played itself out during the pandemic in a negative way.
Right, and it's actually something we talk about at Quartz, for example, how paternity leave might help because not only would it help at the time, but it sort of sets the standard where men are going to change the way they, how much they take up at home. And those are the kinds of small things you don't seem necessarily connected, but all contribute to this. Are there different things that that a person, a woman needs later in the later stages when they come closer to an exit per se, compared to what's happening at WILLA?
Meaning, do female entrepreneurs, when they're looking to become public, face different challenges from men?
Right.
Yeah, sure. Because I think, you know, the ecosystem in general that surrounds the process of tapping public capital markets does still tend to be disproportionately male dominated. And again, until there's parity, that means that women are sort of forcing themselves to fit into the male expectation of what they should be saying, doing, and how they should be running their company, and all of those things. So I do think the bar is higher for women who want to take their companies public. And Marie talked about this, but I think it's really important when you think about the funnel of companies in any economy. You need to have a disproportionate number of women at the top of the funnel, because very few businesses actually survive. And so as you think about that funnel narrowing over time and the requirement for incremental funding from the venture capital community, the private equity community, in order for smaller businesses to eventually become large enough to become public companies, when you start off with a lower base of women, by the time you get to the end of the funnel, it's de minimis what you see for, you know, in terms of female entrepreneurs who are ready to go public. And then at that stage, they're also looking at a process that may not necessarily be geared towards them. So I think, you know, we have to think about it in those terms and understand that. Now, having said all of that, there are some positive signs and things that, you know, we can look toward and feel good about. So I know at the New York Stock Exchange, we've taken several female-led companies public this year with amazing narratives and stories, and seen female entrepreneurs just killing it and doing amazing things with their businesses. I think that we, as a firm, are lucky to have a lot of female leadership disproportionately, not just me, Stacey Cunningham, who runs the exchange. We have a lot of women leaders, and therefore we lean into female entrepreneurs who we can find earlier in the life cycle of their companies and try to make those connections within the broader ecosystem of funding to ensure that they're getting all of the help and funding that they need. The more and more pressure that exists inside of that ecosystem, where the providers of capital, and by that I literally mean the humans who invest their money, whether they're investing their money in a private equity firm or they're investing their money in the equity markets, wherever it is that they're taking their capital and allocating it, the more those humans say, it matters to me that my capital is deployed in a way that's equitable, the more likely we're going to see change at a faster rate than what we've seen today.
So we need to put that pressure on those groups as well. Thank you. We have a couple of questions coming in from the audience. Ashina asks, what role should governments and the private sector play in funding women's business models? Maria, are there interesting things happening in Europe around that question?
Yes, the role of governments, it's interesting. For example, in terms of gender parity, there has been a law passed in France a few years ago, I think I would say 10 years ago, to really oblige boards to have 30% of women. This law has been extremely effective. Right now in France, you have at least 30% of women in every board. At the beginning, it was like, where are we going to find women board members? We don't have enough women, you know, in senior leaderships in companies to fill in all the places we have in boards. But eventually we found them. And now there's a second law of the same type in preparation for executive committees. In order to have at least 30% of women in all corporate excos. So I think there's really something can be done by law to actually to force the movement. I think it's really about gaining time. It's really about not waiting for, the things to happen on their own, because if we wait, in 150 years, we will have gained 5%. So that won't work. We need to make the change happen immediately, and I think quotas are a good way of making this happen. And so I think if you duplicate this type of thing, saying, for example, that private companies, when they have, for example, CVC funds, they commit to funding a certain number of women-led projects, that public banks commit again to funding women projects, etc. I think we can go somewhere. Yeah.
That's great. Thank you so much. And Amanda, how do you feel? Are we getting government support that we need? Or do you see things happening in other countries where there may be a direct investment, even there are funds created for women that you find helpful or would be inspiring?
I think there can always be more that's done. I think in addition to some of the areas that Marie highlighted, which are very, very important, such as greater female representation on boards, greater diverse representation in general on boards, there's an element of transparency too that's required. So in other words, the point I made earlier about we all have capital and we can put that capital to work in ways that we want, and we can influence some of these decisions by putting our own money where our mouth is. We can't do that if we don't have enough transparency into what's actually happening in a very effective way. So I think it's incredibly important, and it's a good role for government to, not only look at issues like what is the representation of female leadership at the board level, but also how is it that we can require companies to continue to disclose more and more information that allows investors, meaning all of us, to determine where it is that they put their capital, such that if you are a public company, for example, and you are not investing in women and you don't have sufficient diversity of senior leadership or board leadership, or there are significant gaps in pay parity for like jobs, that, I can say, well, I'm not going to invest in that company. I don't want, disproportionately, I won't give them my capital. And so it allows us all to sort of have more of a voice if we have more information.
Okay, great.
Yes, and I think, to bounce on this idea, I completely agree with that. And I think, one key initiative is really to make sure that you were talking about disclosing the data, Amanda, but one thing is really make sure that we have the data and that we show the data.
Yep.
And for example, I'm a great admirer of what Gina Davis did with her Institute on Gender in Media, really, tracking the data, making sure that we know the numbers, we have the numbers, and today a lot of organizations and institutions are working on this, because once you begin to count, things can begin to change.
Yeah.
And once we have this data, we can, for example, governments can make companies disclose the data, and then we can have things changing.
And that's great. Are either of you aware of any efforts that are specifically focused on women of color or marginalized women in those countries where women of color are marginalized, or in the US or in Paris? So, are there extra things happening?
So I don't think that I think the same issues that apply in the case of gender parity apply in the case of diversity, and specifically for diverse women, only at a more extreme level. Because the disparity there, I think, is even larger. What's kind of interesting when you look back over time is that the movement as it relates to women and women's parity started a little bit before not long, but a little bit before the movement for racial, ethnic, and other parity. And so I think it's a little bit behind, and it came from a worse starting place. So a lot of the complexity that the economies and businesses face as it relates to gender parity from an entrepreneurial perspective, from a business perspective, they apply but by a factor of X, whatever X is, for diverse individuals. And so we kind of need to get all of the solutions right to push across all fronts. And I think we are seeing some change in that regard. So for example, one of the things that the New York Stock Exchange does, I think, really well is that we have a board advisory council, and that is a group of 20 CEOs across who have different backgrounds, different industries, they're listed companies. So they're NYSE listed CEOs, and we get them together and we say to them, you have to provide us with diverse board candidates such that as companies are going public and they're looking to fill out their board and make their board more diverse, because again, that's what investors want, the ones with the capital to put to work. And in many cases, because it's required, that we actually have actionable solutions to help them do that. And so over time, that database itself has evolved to be not just about gender diversity, but to be about diversity more broadly. And I think it's important that the effort we put into one area gets put into both, and that we probably lean a little bit harder into some of the troubles and problems that face other diverse communities, because I think they're greater and potentially more ingrained.
Okay, great.
And also, maybe I completely agree with what you said, Amanda. Maybe, the trickle down effect you were talking about at the beginning, I think happens when diversity is concerned. What I see at WILLA is that in the startups where we make sure there is a woman founder, there is a natural diversity in general coming out of the fact that at the top there is gender diversity. And I think that diversity generates diversity. The more diversity you have, the more diversity you create in the company. And so in women-led startups, for example, usually you have it's easier to create this environment where you value diverse opinions, backgrounds, and you make innovative products and solutions out of this diversity. And so you have diversity in ages, nationalities, backgrounds, colors, etc. And this is a very virtuous circle.
Yeah, diversity begets diversity, and diversity of thought, diversity across all metrics. I very much agree. Maybe we should disagree on something, Marie. I don't know. Let's figure out what it is.
It looks like we've been knowing each other for forever.
Yeah, maybe it'll be more interesting for the audience.
Well, I do have one question. I mean, there are a lot of, you see quite a bit of press stories about how women, the role that women play in this is that they maybe have imposter syndrome or they're not confident enough. And I wonder, is that gaslighting to say that, or is that also true in your experience?
Oh, I think it's nonsense.
Okay.
I think it's nonsense. I'm so impressed and amazed by the women I see out there and their capabilities, their strength, their character, the confidence that they bring to bear. There's just no reason whatsoever in the world why there should be that perception of women, because in many cases and in many ways, they're more confident and competent than their male peers.
Right. Yep.
I hate when people blame it on women. I mean, it's not women that have to change; it's the world that has to change. I mean, and they have to make it change. But all together we have to make it change. I think I think men and women are different. I do believe that we have different strengths, and probably also different styles of leadership. And we just need to make sure that all of those styles of leaderships and are able to work together at the same level, and that women don't have to absolutely fill in the standards that have been set by men, basically, and that we don't have to transform ourselves into something that we aren't in order to be able to, access the top positions. So I really hate it when we blame it on women, that women are not one thing or another, and that they should change or do things better, or
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I know just as many women who are told to be more feminine in order to succeed in the workforce as I know women who are told to be more aggressive. And so, the idea in either direction is just be effective, be an effective leader, be a responsible leader, drive change. That matters. There are different styles and different ways of getting to the same result. And I think we should be open to those. And we shouldn't have a gendered norm in our mind of what it looks like to be a leader, to drive change, and to do positive things.
Great. I agree.
And I think sorry, Lila, I think in this area, media have a really big role to play in the way they make women leaders visible. And I was very happy to see, for example, that in the last Times list of the 100 most influential people of the year 2021, there were as many women as men being tagged as pioneers, innovators, leaders, artists, icons, etc. And so I think we need to really make this diversity of leaderships visible in order to make it normal. And it's about gender, it's about diversity in general. We need to show more that good can come out of very different models, and that all of that is building our world.
Oh, fantastic. It's good to know we have a role as well. I mean, it's great to be reminded. I do have one last question, which is, how will we use our collective power? For each of you, I'm going to ask, how will we use our collective power with purpose for a more inclusive world? Amanda.
You mean personally, how would I use my power? Or how should we as a group?
Me as a group.
I think it's putting our capital to work. That's fundamentally, and maybe that's because I've spent 20 years working in the capital markets, but I really do believe that fundamentally we can reward performance for the things that we value. And so there's a collective call to action on this, and the collective call to action is put the capital where you want to see where you're seeing the results that you want to see, and don't put capital where you're seeing results that you don't want to see. There's an inherent economic effect that goes along with that, and that effect is that the businesses that aren't doing what we want them to see will not succeed, and the businesses that are will on a disproportionate level. And it kind of moves in many ways across almost everything that we do. It's like, read what you think is valuable to read. Don't if it's not valuable to you. Over time, the demand for what is out there in the world will help to shape what the supply looks like. And so I think, fundamentally, we all have an important call to action here, which is, put our assets, put our time, put all the things that are valuable to us towards the change that we want to see. And don't put it towards the change that we don't want to see.
Great. Thank you. Marie, do you agree, or feel free to disagree?
No, I do agree. Again, no, I think the role of capital and money is crucial. Absolutely. I would add, we need to create stories. Showing success stories, telling great stories of women who succeeded, and because we need to inspire the youngest, and we need to make sure that we change this culture, this the basis of the society we live in today that is so biased, and all the biases that we fight today come from the fact that we need to create a new collective story, a new compelling and inspiring story when women and diversity in general has all its place.
Wonderful. Okay. Thank you so much. That's some really great points there. It's really lovely to talk to you both.
Thank you so much,
Lila.
Lila.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.